So we've been hearing a lot about the Mass, but now it's time to take a closer look at the mystery and the meaning of what the Mass really is, and get into it. You've probably noticed that the first thing that happens in Mass is everyone stands, and part of that is because we acknowledge that the priest is there in persona Christi, so we kind of stand for that. But in a deeper way, you realize that he's also standing. And he's not just standing there, he's going down the aisle with the servers. They're walking, they're processing somewhere. And when we stand, it's like we're going with him. He's going somewhere. He's going to the altar. So often we show up to Mass and we don't think that anything's going to happen. We don't think that anything's going to change. And we kind of look at it like no one's going anywhere. But when we stand at the beginning of Mass, it's like the priest of God is walking with the people of God to the altar of God to receive the very body, blood, soul, and divinity of God. We stand because we're on a journey. We're on a pilgrimage. We're headed somewhere. We are headed to the altar of God. And when the priest gets there, that's why he goes up to it and he bows down and he venerates the altar. He kisses the altar. Because this altar, this is the place which is the source of all grace. Now, the fancy term for the Mass is called the liturgy. And liturgy means work or service. In fact, it means a public work done in the service of another. So the first thing we realize about the liturgy is that it's public. It's never a private thing. It's never just me, but it's done as a community and it's done publicly. But the second thing is that the liturgy, the Mass, is a work, it's an action. A lot of times we show up for Mass and we don't expect anything to happen. In fact, we don't expect to be a part of it at all. Instead of being full participants, we're kind of just passive observers. But in the liturgy, we're meant to take part in this action, in this work, in this service. The liturgy of the Mass is broken down into two liturgies. The first is called the Liturgy of the Word, and the second is called the Liturgy of the Eucharist. In the Liturgy of the Word, we have the readings at Mass, we have the homily, we have the creed, and we have the prayers of the faithful. When it comes to the liturgy of the Word, a lot of times we sit down and we're just simply passive. We just simply kind of listen, or we simply zone out. But this is the moment where God, our Father, is speaking to his children. Rather than sit back and be passive, we're meant to sit down and be receptive. What is it that God is trying to tell me in this Mass? Where is it that God is trying to lead me through these readings? What is it that God is trying to show me through his Word? The second liturgy is called the Liturgy of the Eucharist, and it's all about offering. It's all about offering up the Eucharist, the thanksgiving of the Son to the Father. In fact, the very first thing we do in the Liturgy of the Eucharist is the offertory. When the bread and wine are walked down the aisle and placed upon the altar, they're offered to God. What we're meant to do is offer ourselves to God, our prayers, our cares, to offer our sufferings and our joys, to offer the people that we love and offer the people that we need to love more, to place them on the altar. But then the greatest offering in the Liturgy of the Eucharist is the offering of the Son to the Father in the Eucharist. In that too, a lot of times we simply watch, we're simply passive observers, but we're meant to lift up and offer the sacrifice of the Eucharist with the priest to the Father. We're not meant to simply watch at the Mass, we're meant to worship at the Mass. And that's what the liturgy is all about. In the Liturgy of the Word, we receive God in his Word. And in the Liturgy of the Eucharist, we offer to God his very self in the Eucharist. It might not feel like it, but everything we do at the Mass is meant to be an encounter with Jesus. We don't show up to just talk about Jesus, and we don't show up to simply learn about Jesus. Everything in the Mass is oriented towards actually meeting Jesus. And the most profound place that we will ever encounter Jesus on this earth is in the Eucharist. So what do we do with this? I mean, to realize that here is the God of the universe who's not only come down onto this altar, but he stepped off the altar in the Eucharist into your life, into my life, into your very body and soul. The last thing we'd want to do is just receive and leave, but just imagine at this moment, God dwells in you. What do? Well, in the Mass, it's called the communion meditation, and we go back to our pews. A lot of times we just sit there and we just kind of daydream. But what could you do to know that here is this God who loves you and realizes that you are not only worth dying for way back when, but you're worth dying for right now? We sit down or we kneel down and we just say thanks. We just measure out the love of a God whose love is immeasurable. And we observe how great he thinks that you are. And then we come to the end of Mass. And we've been formed by his word, where we've offered up everything to the Father, including his Son, where God has offered everything back to us, including his Son. And then, filled with the very presence of God, we are sent with that final blessing out into the world to be the presence of God to a world that longs for him.